Jacob Ellis had everything: a beautiful family, a thriving business, and a life filled with promise. But one fateful morning, that perfect world was shattered. His wife Emily and their 2 children, Sophie and Max, were brutally murdered in their own home. The police suspected Jacob, the grieving husband and father, but the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. As Jacob uncovered a shocking betrayal from within his closest circle, he was forced to confront the chilling reality. The massacre was not a random act of violence. It was a meticulously planned revenge, orchestrated by someone he had once trusted with his very life. It was a cold, still morning when Jacob Ellis received the call that would shatter his world. Having just returned from a week-long business trip, he was eager to be home with his family. The flight had been long, and all he wanted was to embrace his wife, Emily, and see his 2 kids, Sophie and Max. The last thing he expected was the feeling of dread that crept over him as he pulled into the driveway of their suburban home. At first, everything appeared normal. The small house on Maple Street sat quietly in the morning light, the yard trimmed neatly as it always was. But something felt off. It wasn't the usual warmth he felt coming home after being away. As he stepped out of the car, he noticed the silence. There were no sounds of the kids playing or Emily humming in the kitchen. He called out as he walked toward the front door, but his voice echoed back at him with no response. Inside, the house was still. The kind of stillness that immediately sent a cold chill down his spine. As he stepped through the doorway, he felt the knot tighten in his stomach. The front hallway, usually filled with the chaotic rush of family life, was eerily quiet. Jacob's first thought was that perhaps Emily had stepped out for groceries, or maybe the kids were playing upstairs. But as he ventured further into the house, his heart began to race. The living room looked untouched. The couch was neatly arranged, a coffee mug left on the table. But something didn't feel right. He stepped toward the kitchen, calling out again, but the silence swallowed his words. Then he saw it. At the far end of the room, near the door to the hallway, lay Emily. Jacob froze, his breath catching in his throat. His wife, Emily, lay motionless on the floor. Her body was positioned unnaturally, and her face, twisted in an expression of terror, haunted him instantly. It took him several moments before he could process what he was seeing. He stumbled back, his mind racing, unable to make sense of the horrifying image before him. He reached for his phone, hands trembling, and dialed 911. His voice broke as he spoke, barely able to get the words out. "My wife, she's gone. I think something's happened to my family." As he waited for the operator to respond, Jacob felt his body move automatically, as if his mind couldn't catch up with his legs. He ran upstairs to the children's rooms, praying that somehow this was a nightmare. But when he opened the door to Sophie's bedroom, he found her lying in her bed, her small body still and lifeless. Max's room was no different. His son, only 5 years old, was tucked into his bed as though he had peacefully drifted off to sleep. Except there was no peace in his expression. Jacob stumbled backward, the room spinning around him. It was clear that something terrible had happened here, something beyond his understanding. The brutality of the scene overwhelmed him. There were no signs of forced entry, no windows broken, nothing stolen. The house was pristine, with only the presence of death hanging in the air. It didn't make sense. Emergency responders arrived shortly after, and Jacob could barely answer their questions. His mind was reeling. How had this happened? Why was his family targeted? The police quickly moved in, cordoning off the house, starting their investigation with grim determination. But Jacob wasn't the only one left with more questions than answers. Whoever had done this had planned it carefully. It was almost as if they had known the house and its inhabitants intimately. As the hours passed, Jacob remained in a state of shock, unable to comprehend the enormity of what had unfolded. But one thing was clear. Someone had stolen the most precious thing from him, and Jacob knew that he would stop at nothing to find out who and why. The days following the massacre were a blur for Jacob Ellis. His mind was trapped in a fog of confusion and despair, his world shattered beyond recognition. The house, once filled with the noise of his children's laughter and his wife's comforting presence, now stood empty, cold, and silent. He couldn't bring himself to step into the rooms where his children had slept, where they had once played, and where they had been taken from him in such a brutal, senseless manner. Each time he tried, the memory of their lifeless bodies would consume him, and he'd collapse into grief all over again. The police had immediately started their investigation, but nothing seemed to make sense. The house showed no signs of a struggle, no broken locks, no windows forced open, no sign of an intruder. The door was locked from the inside when Jacob arrived, making it clear that whoever had done this had either been let in or knew the family well enough to avoid drawing attention. The authorities combed through every corner of the house, taking samples, dusting for fingerprints, and questioning Jacob relentlessly. His hands were shaking as he answered each question, but no one could tell him anything that made sense. In the early hours of the investigation, Jacob's name was brought up, and it was as though the world shifted beneath him. The police, the detectives, the people around him, all of them began to look at him differently. At first, the accusations were subtle, almost unnoticeable, but as the investigation wore on, the suspicion became harder to ignore. He was the husband. He was the father. Who else would have the most to gain from his family's deaths? The media quickly latched on to the story. With every passing day, the headlines grew more sensational, and the gossip more venomous. Grieving husband or cold-blooded killer, one headline read. The mystery of Jacob Ellis. Was he hiding something? Neighbors and acquaintances began to whisper about him in hushed tones. Emily's family, though supportive at first, began to question whether Jacob was involved. They wondered whether there had been any hidden financial troubles in the family, any signs of marital issues that might have driven him to snap. They weren't the only ones. Jacob found himself isolated, surrounded by a wall of suspicion. His friends, once his support system, began to distance themselves, unsure of whether they should trust him. Even his own brother-in-law began to ask pointed questions, trying to uncover any possible motive Jacob might have had. Was he involved in shady business deals? Did he have enemies that could have targeted his family in revenge? Jacob could feel his life slipping away, piece by piece. Despite his protests, despite his cries of innocence, the more the authorities investigated, the more tangled the web became. His bank records were scrutinized, his phone records examined, and even his past relationships were questioned. The police seemed determined to find something, anything that would prove he had a hand in his family's deaths. Yet everything came back clean. No one could find a reason. The grief was suffocating, but now it was mixed with the growing weight of being presumed guilty. Jacob spent countless sleepless nights alone in the house, staring at the walls that had once witnessed so much joy. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to hurt his family, But the detectives were relentless. They kept telling him to remain patient, that answers would come. But with every passing day, the suspicion around him grew stronger. He tried to hold on to hope, tried to believe that the truth would eventually come to light. But every time the doorbell rang, his heart would race, thinking that the police would show up again with another round of questions. He had no answers. No one did. All Jacob knew for sure was that his family was gone, and he was left behind to carry the unbearable weight of their absence and now the growing doubt about his own involvement. Months passed with little progress in the investigation, but Jacob's life was now consumed by one singular question. Who had killed his family? The grief and pain were constant, but the crushing weight of being accused, of being suspected, of committing the unthinkable, was unbearable. It was as if the world had turned against him. Friends, neighbors, even his own family began to treat him with caution, with suspicion. Every interaction felt like an interrogation, and Jacob's attempts to grieve were overshadowed by the endless questions and probing eyes. The police investigation seemed stuck in a never-ending loop. They had interviewed everyone they could think of, his colleagues, Emily's friends, even the neighbors, but every lead seemed to fizzle out. The initial suspicions about a robbery gone wrong had been quickly ruled out, as nothing of value had been taken from the house. There were no signs of forced entry, and the crime was far too personal. Whoever had done this knew the family and knew them well. Jacob's alibi was airtight. He had been out of town for the entire week of the murders. The police had thoroughly investigated his whereabouts, checked flight records, and confirmed his attendance at meetings across the country. It was the one thing that kept him from being arrested outright. He couldn't have committed the crime. But that didn't mean he was free of suspicion. For Jacob, the unbearable frustration was the lack of answers. He wanted to scream at the world that he had nothing to hide, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone out there knew more than they were letting on. It wasn't until a seemingly insignificant tip came in that the case began to take an unexpected turn. It started with a phone call from a former neighbor, a man named Tom Harris, who had moved out of the area months before the tragedy. Tom, who had been living in a different part of the city, mentioned something that seemed trivial at first. He recalled seeing a man in a dark hoodie one night, just a few days before the murders, walking behind the Ellis house. Tom didn't think much of it at the time, as he assumed it was just someone cutting through the alleyway or taking a shortcut. But now Tom thought it might be worth mentioning given the circumstances. His description of the man wasn't detailed, just a dark figure with a hood. But it was the first lead the police had received that didn't involve Jacob or his immediate circle. The authorities quickly jumped on the lead, reviewing neighborhood surveillance footage to track the mysterious figure's movements. They found the man on a nearby camera, walking with purpose down the alley that ran behind the Ellis property. He appeared to be in a hurry, heading toward the backyard. It wasn't much, but it was something. The police began canvassing the area for more witnesses and began questioning anyone who might have seen something unusual. They traced the man's movements to a nearby abandoned house, a place that had long been a target for urban explorers and local teenagers. What they found inside the abandoned house would change everything. There, in a room filled with dust and broken furniture, they uncovered a stash of items that immediately raised alarms. Among the scattered debris were photos of the Ellis family, pictures of Jacob, Emily, and their children, taken from their own home. There were other disturbing items too, journals filled with strange notes and obsessive writings about the cult, family, as well as a set of maps with the Ellis home circled in red ink. Whoever had been behind the massacre had not only planned the killings, but had been watching the family for a long time. The discovery was chilling. The man in the hoodie wasn't just a random stranger. He had been watching Jacob and his family, and now the police were beginning to suspect that this was no simple burglary gone wrong. It was a calculated personal attack. The question was, who was this person, and why did they have such an intense obsession with the Ellis family? The police identified the figure in the footage as Nathaniel Drake, a man from Jacob's past. Nathaniel had once worked with Jacob years earlier, during a failed business venture. Their professional relationship had soured when the deal went under, and Jacob hadn't heard from Nathaniel since. It seemed too coincidental at first. Why would someone from so long ago resurface now? But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Nathaniel had been harboring a deep resentment toward Jacob for years. It was a startling revelation, and Jacob's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. Nathaniel had been watching them. He had been planning this for months. And now, the terrifying truth was becoming clear. The massacre of his family had been meticulously orchestrated by someone who had never truly let go of past grievances. Jacob had no idea how deep Nathaniel's hatred ran, but the fact that he had been so involved in their lives, so determined to destroy them, shook Jacob to his core. But the question remained, why now? What had triggered Nathaniel's decision to act? The police were determined to find out, but as they dug deeper, the true horrors of Nathaniel's obsession would soon come to light. As the investigation into Nathaniel Drake deepened, the layers of the twisted plot began to unfold, revealing a disturbing truth. Nathaniel Drake was not just some random, vengeful figure from Jacob's past. He had been meticulously planning the destruction of Jacob's life for years. The more the police uncovered, the clearer it became that this was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It was a carefully constructed plan driven by obsession and rage. Nathaniel's journals, which had been discovered in the abandoned house, provided chilling insight into the depths of his mind. They weren't just full of vague thoughts or fleeting resentment. They were filled with disturbing detail, notes on Jacob's daily routines, his business meetings, his family's schedules. He had been tracking their every move, documenting their lives as if they were characters in a dark, personal narrative. Nathaniel had followed Jacob's every step, knowing exactly when he would be away on business, when Emily and the kids would be at home, and even the little things that made their lives unique. His obsession with the family had grown over time, and the murder of Jacob's family had been the tragic culmination of that obsession. But what shocked the investigators the most was the discovery of a second person involved, someone far closer to Jacob than he had ever suspected. As the police delved into Nathaniel's history and connections, they uncovered the startling revelation that Sarah Lawson, Jacob's business partner, had been working with Nathaniel all along. Sarah had been feeding him information about Jacob's life, the family's routines, and even their financial dealings. She had been aiding and abetting Nathaniel, knowingly participating in his plans to destroy Jacob's life from the inside out. Jacob had always trusted Sarah. She was his closest confidant in the business world, a long-time colleague with whom he had shared everything, from professional decisions to personal moments. He had never suspected her involvement in anything remotely sinister. Sarah had been the person Jacob turned to when things got difficult, and she had always appeared to have his best interests at heart. But the truth was far darker than he could have ever imagined. Sarah's motive was rooted in greed. Behind the facade of professionalism, she had been embezzling funds from their company for years. The scale of the financial crimes was staggering. As Jacob's business grew, Sarah's secret thefts grew as well. She had been funneling money from their joint venture into her own accounts, building a small fortune on the back of Jacob's success. But when Jacob began to notice some discrepancies and asked her about the company's finances, Sarah realized that her secret could be exposed. That's when she decided to take matters into her own hands. In her twisted mind, Sarah believed that if she could orchestrate Jacob's downfall, she would be able to seize control of the business. With Jacob out of the picture, she could cover her tracks and take over everything they had built together. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. Nathaniel, with his obsessive tendencies, was the perfect accomplice. They had worked together, in secret, communicating through coded messages and careful planning, each feeding off the other's anger and resentment toward Jacob. The plan was simple, at least in their minds. Nathaniel would break into the Ellis home, murder the family, and leave behind enough evidence to frame Jacob as the prime suspect. Sarah would then be in the clear, her thefts covered by the chaos of the murder investigation. The scheme was set in motion, and on the night of the killings, Nathaniel carried out the gruesome task with brutal precision. But things hadn't gone as planned. Nathaniel had underestimated the police investigation and Jacob's determination to find the truth. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. And now Jacob knew that the nightmare wasn't just about losing his family. It was about being betrayed by those he trusted most. As the authorities closed in on Sarah and Nathaniel, Jacob felt a surge of conflicting emotions, rage, disbelief, and a deep sorrow. The people he had trusted with his life had taken everything from him, all for their own gain. The final twist came when Sarah was arrested, and she revealed the full extent of her betrayal. She confessed to her role in the crime, admitting that she had been the one to orchestrate everything from the shadows, manipulating Nathaniel to do her bidding. The shock of hearing Sarah's confession was almost too much for Jacob to process. She had been the person he trusted with his business, his future, and now she had torn his life apart just to save herself from the consequences of her actions. As the investigation reached its conclusion, Jacob was left in a state of disbelief. He had lost everything, his family, his business, his sense of trust, and in the end, it was all because of the lies and betrayal of those closest to him. Nathaniel and Sarah were both arrested, charged with the murders and numerous counts of fraud, but the damage they had caused was irreversible. Jacob's family was gone, and the life he had known was nothing more than a distant memory. But even in the face of such overwhelming loss, Jacob vowed one thing: he would never stop searching for the truth. Despite the pain and betrayal, he knew that finding justice for his family, no matter how long it took, was the only way to honor their memory. Months passed since Nathaniel and Sarah's arrests, but for Jacob, time had come to a standstill. The world around him moved forward, but he remained locked in a cycle of grief and despair. The court proceedings against Sarah and Nathaniel had dragged on, with each hearing further digging into the traumatic events of that fateful day. Their confessions, though damning, hadn't provided Jacob with the closure he had hoped for. Every word from Sarah and Nathaniel felt like another stab to his heart, each revelation reminding him of just how deeply he had been betrayed. The trial was grueling. Sarah was sentenced to life in prison for her role in orchestrating the murders and embezzling from the company, while Nathaniel was sentenced to death for his brutal actions. Both had shown no remorse during the proceedings, and the coldness in their demeanor haunted Jacob as he sat in the courtroom, struggling to make sense of it all. He couldn't understand how people he had trusted, people who had once been like family, could be so cruel. Jacob had expected that their arrests would bring him some sense of peace, but it didn't. Instead, the quiet was suffocating. The house, which once felt like a home, now felt like a tomb. It had been months since Emily, Sophie and Max had been taken from him, yet the pain felt as fresh as ever. He was haunted by dreams, nightmares of that day, of walking into his home and finding them gone. Their faces lingered in his mind, twisted in terror. He had lost so much. The emptiness of his life was now compounded by guilt. He wondered if there had been signs he missed, moments when he could have prevented this horror. The fact that it had all been orchestrated by people he trusted only deepened the ache. But the guilt was a part of the grieving process. And slowly, Jacob began to realize he couldn't keep blaming himself. The responsibility lay solely with Sarah and Nathaniel. They had chosen to destroy his family, and no amount of self-punishment would change that. Jacob sold the house that had once been filled with laughter and love. He couldn't bear to stay there, surrounded by memories of what had been. Moving out felt like the first step toward healing, but it wasn't easy. He tried to rebuild his life in a new place, but the weight of the past was always with him. As the years passed, Jacob focused on one thing: keeping the memory of his family alive. He started a foundation in Emily, Sophie, and Max's name, dedicating it to helping families who had experienced the kind of loss he had endured. It wasn't much, but it gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to wake up each morning. Through the foundation, he met others who had suffered in similar ways, and while their stories were different, they shared a common thread: the unbearable weight of losing loved ones to violence. Though Jacob couldn't bring his family back, he found some comfort in knowing that their deaths had led to positive change. His work with the foundation helped him feel connected to them in a way that nothing else could. But even as he worked tirelessly to support others, a part of him would always remain broken. The years hadn't dulled the pain. The house was gone, but the memories still haunted him. Jacob never truly understood why Sarah and Nathaniel had targeted his family, why they had chosen to destroy everything he held dear. Perhaps he never would. But in the end, Jacob knew that the story of his family, their love, their laughter, their joy, could never be erased. It would live on, not in the house they once inhabited, but in the foundation he had built in their memory. And for the first time in a long time, Jacob began to feel that perhaps, just maybe, he could start to heal. He could never forget, but he could honor them by continuing to live, to move forward. The pain would never go away, but he knew that he had to try to find peace in whatever way he could.